Thomas Jefferson once said, "If a people expect to be ignorant and free, they expect what never was and never can be." And it's true, democratic government depends on people being at least knowledgeable enough to make basic choices about how their government operates. That's why Americans have had public taxpayer-funded schools for centuries. In fact, Massachusetts created a public school system a century and a half before the Constitution was written. But is it really wise to put government in charge of education? After all, government can be a dangerous and clumsy thing, and very self-interested. What's to stop politicians from using the school system to indoctrinate the rising generation of Americans with their own preferred ideologies? That has happened many times in the past, and even today in countries like Iran and North Korea, the government uses schools to brainwash students with communist or anti-Semitic ideas. Even in the United States, politicians have often used government-run schools as tools of indoctrination. At the beginning of the 20th century, for example, members of the progressive movement actually tried to outlaw private schools because they thought American children should be forced into a single public system where they would be made into loyal citizens. The idea was that if kids were taught at home or at churches, they wouldn't have any shared beliefs, and that would lead to political disagreement and social strife. So, to create social unity, it was thought better to have government mold all the country's kids into good Americans. The U.S. Supreme Court eventually declared that unconstitutional. In a couple decisions in the 1920s, it declared that although states can force parents to get educations for their children, it can't force parents to send their kids to public schools. "The fundamental theory of liberty upon which all governments in this union repose," said the court, "excludes any general power of the state to standardize its children. By forcing them to accept instruction from public teachers only, the child is not the mere creature of the state." For most of American history, public and private schools have coexisted. Parents could decide whether to send their children to one or the other. It wasn't really until the 1950s that federal funding and regulation of the nation's schools became so dominant that today government has a virtual monopoly on education in the United States. And of course, that's true not just of elementary and high schools, but also of universities, which are now so heavily subsidized and regulated that even so-called private colleges are basically just government-run institutions. That kind of control is dangerous because it distorts the free flow of ideas that should make up a good education. In a free society, parents would be in charge with respect to the education of their children, because if their schools taught wrong and offensive ideas, the parents could refuse to fund those schools. And college students would be able to select colleges that best suit their own values and give them a well-rounded education. That's not really the case today. In fact, the government's near monopoly over education is so strong that it's virtually impossible to fire even incompetent school employees. So when schools teach false ideas, taxpayers can't really do anything meaningful about it. For the most part, they're compelled to fund the propagation of false ideas against their will. And the enormous education bureaucracy in Washington, D.C. considers that a good thing because it fosters unity. Of course, unity is always an alarming idea if you prize diversity. In fact, government schools have driven out true debate and enforced an orthodoxy to an alarming degree already. That's not by accident. It's because government doesn't have to satisfy customers, that is, taxpayers. Government gets paid whether it does a good job or not. Also, those in charge tend to do favors for people they agree with, which means that ideological pressure groups exploit their power to entrench themselves. Politically minded professors enforce orthodoxy by refusing to hire new professors who have different opinions. The result is that universities become dominated by one particular ideology from generation to generation, and professors become something more like a priesthood than a group of intellectuals seeking the truth. Statistics show just how lopsided the American education system is. Something like 60% of university faculty call themselves liberal or far left, and only 12% call themselves conservative or far right. The figures are even more lopsided among college administrators. Only 6% of them call themselves conservative, and 71% call themselves liberal or very liberal. Some schools have no conservative or libertarian voices on the faculty at all. But many professors don't even realize they're ideological because they surround themselves with people who always agree with them. So eventually, they assume that anybody who disagrees with them must just be a bad scholar. The fact that schools are dominated by one ideological group means that there are no checks and balances in place to protect students from abusive administrators. So abuses of power are rarely redressed. The problem is worse in the realm of K-12 schools, because parents are typically forced to send their kids to the school in their neighborhood instead of choosing what school to send their kids to. Imagine if we ran other industries that way. What if you were forced to buy a new car every year, whether you wanted one or not, from the dealer closest to your house, regardless of quality or price? That would be absurd, and it would eliminate the dealer's incentives to reduce prices and improve quality. But that's basically how government-run schools have operated for something like 75 years. The only real solution to this problem would be to promote and protect freedom of choice in education as much as possible. How can that be done? One option was suggested by the philosopher Ayn Rand, who argued for what she called a fairness doctrine in education. That term comes from the way radio and television used to be regulated. When she was writing, radio and TV airwaves were considered public property, so the government imposed a rule forcing broadcasters to give equal time to people of different political beliefs. By the same logic, Rand wrote, schools should be forced to give equal time to different ideological groups. If the public allegedly owns the universities, she wrote, then for all the same reasons no specific ideology can be permitted to hold a monopoly in any department of any public or semi-public university. In all such institutions, every significant viewpoint must be given representation. Another idea was offered by the economist Milton Friedman. He suggested that K-12 schools could be improved by replacing the government-run education monopoly with a system that let parents choose which schools to send their children to. The idea is that if the government is going to spend, say, $10,000 on a student's education, instead of sending that money to the neighborhood school, it should let the parents decide what school to send their kids to, and then send the money to that school. This idea, called a voucher system, would create something like the competition that exists in a free market, because schools would have to improve quality in order to attract students and funding. The voucher idea has been criticized for two main reasons. First, some people object that it would mean the government giving taxpayer money to schools run by churches, and the Constitution prohibits the government from supporting churches with tax dollars. That's a reasonable concern, but there are ways to fix that problem. Many states, such as Arizona, have adopted a different system called the Empowerment Scholarship Account, or ESA program, where parents receive the funding directly and choose where to spend it. That's different from a voucher system because the money does not go from the government to the school, but from the government to the parent who decides what to do with it. Just like if the government gives someone food stamps and lets them decide what grocery store to spend them at. The second objection to letting parents choose the schools their kids go to is that if parents send their kids to good schools, then the bad schools will only get worse, since the best students will have left and failing schools will lose funding. Therefore, the argument goes, we should keep all the kids in the bad schools and just give the bad schools more money. That's a silly argument. I mean, by that logic, you should be forced to eat at bad restaurants, because after all, if you eat at good restaurants, the bad ones will only get worse. That's an argument against all freedom of choice. Worse, it's an argument for sacrificing children's educational needs to the desires of the education bureaucracy, especially the most gifted kids. Our goal ought to be to improve education, not to prop up failing schools. What about government simply prohibiting schools from teaching certain things? The main problem with that idea is the threat to so-called academic freedom. Government should not be turning schools into propaganda mills, of course. But on the other hand, that is already happening now. And at least in K-12 schools, the government does have the legitimate authority to establish a curriculum. In other words, it is allowed to say what must be taught in government-run schools, so there's no reason why it cannot also limit what is taught there. At a minimum, schools should be required to inform parents about what is being taught in the classrooms their tax dollars pay for. Today, there's plenty of demand for alternatives to the status quo, But it's very hard for colleges to satisfy that demand because so many colleges are funded so much by government money. And with government money, strings are attached. Those strings help perpetuate the monopoly. For example, the overwhelming majority of scientific research in the United States is funded by the government-run National Science Foundation. So scientists and researchers are forced to spend much of their time doing paperwork to apply for grants instead of doing experiments. That doesn't leave them with time to try radical new ideas, and radical new ideas would probably be denied funding. The regulations that come with government funding can also be used to punish people who challenge the system. For example, in 2018, a group of scholars wanted to prove that higher education is dominated by the political left, so they wrote a bunch of fake scholarly papers full of left-wing jargon and submitted them to scholarly journals. And sure enough, the journals accepted many of the papers for publication, which proved the researchers' point. How did the universities react? By trying to punish the researchers. One of them, Professor Peter Boghossian, was accused of misconduct on the theory that he had experimented on human subjects against their will, the human subjects in this case being the editors of the journals. Of course, it's against federal regulations to experiment on human beings against their will. Boghossian resigned from his university. Increasing competition in the realm of education is a worthwhile goal, and ESA projects and transparency laws are all good ideas. But none are a perfect solution. That's because the real problem is government's almost total control over education, which is incompatible with the principles of freedom. Think about it. Government has virtually no incentive to teach children to be skeptical of government. Quite the opposite. As the journalist Isabel Patterson wrote in 1943, every politically controlled education system will inculcate the doctrine of state supremacy sooner or later. Once that doctrine has been accepted, it becomes an almost superhuman task to break the stranglehold of the political power over the life of the citizen. It has had his body, property, and mind in its clutches from infancy. And that's hardly the way to raise a generation of people who expect to enjoy and preserve freedom.